Greetings and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Theages. The topic of Plato's Theages is wisdom. Now, wisdom is the goal of philosophy, which means literally love of wisdom. So wisdom would seem to be the most exalted topic of Plato's dialogues. And yet, Plato chose to take up this topic through a dialogue between Socrates and a mere boy. Let's take a closer look to see if we can make sense of Plato's choice. Now, Socrates did not choose this conversation. Theages' father, Demodocus, approaches Socrates and asks him if he could give him some advice about a very important matter, the education of his son. The dialogue then falls into two main parts. The first is Socrates' exchange with Demodocus, in which Demodocus says that he's worried. He's worried because Theages wants to become wise. As a result, it seems that Theages wants to study with the sophists, the so-called wise men. Now, Demodocus is worried that these sophisticates will corrupt his son. In the second, much longer part of the dialogue, Socrates steers the conversation to Theages himself. This part also falls into two main sections. In the first section, Socrates draws out what Theages wants to become wise in. Turns out that Theages wants to become wise in ruling over human beings in the city. Theages, in fact, wants to become a sole ruler, which in Greek is a tyrannos, or tyrant. In the second section of this second part, Socrates talks with Theages about whom Socrates and Demodocus should send Theages to study with. Socrates first suggests sending Theages to the tyrants themselves, but Theages nixes this idea. He doesn't want to rule by force, he wants to rule over willing subjects. In fact, he says, he wants to rule over all human beings, or at least most human beings. He wants, he says, to become a god. He's ambitious, to say the least. Next, Socrates suggests sending Theages to the politicians, the gentlemen who rule over willing subjects. Theages nixes this idea too. He uses Socrates' own arguments about the inability of the politicians to educate their sons in politics against Socrates himself. Third, Theages also rules out studying with the sophists, the so-called wise guys. In fact, he wants to study with Socrates himself. Now, Demodocus, his father, likes this idea. At the very least, then, the conversation with Socrates seems to have unified father and son. Now, in response, Socrates gives a long speech about his daimonion, his famous divine sign. Socrates says that this voice, which only he can hear, speaks only in prohibitions. Sometimes it tells him what his friends shouldn't do. Sometimes it tells Socrates what Socrates shouldn't do. It often prohibits him from spending time with other people, he says. Now, Socrates does admit that some of the people who spend time with him are improved and stay better. Many people, however, he says, fail to retain anything of what they got from Socrates. Socrates shares the words of one fellow named Aristides, who chalked up his own temporary improvement to just being near Socrates. So, Socrates concludes, if the god is against his spending time with Theages, it'll be no use. Theages has a wonderful response. He says, let's test the god. If we spend time together and it works, well, then the god must be pleased. If it doesn't work, then we can reconsider things. Demodocus, his father, heartily agrees, and Socrates at last relents. The last words of the dialogue are, let's do it. Now, a few things to note about this charming little dialogue. First of all, references in the dialogue to current events place its dramatic date at 409 BC. In 399 BC, 10 years later, Socrates will be executed by Athens for, among other things, corrupting the young. So in only 10 years, Socrates goes from being someone whom a respectable gentleman consults about educating his son to someone that the Athenian gentlemen execute for corrupting their sons. Socrates' fate hangs over this little dialogue on wisdom. Second, this dialogue is as noticeable for the things Socrates does not say as for what he does say. As we've seen, Theages boldly says that he wants to become a tyrant, then ruler of the whole world, even a god. Well, Socrates never rebukes him for these desires. When Theages boldly cites Socrates' own criticisms of the leading politicians, that they fail to educate their own sons in politics, Socrates does not deny that these are, in fact, his arguments. When Socrates suggests that Theages study with gentlemen, Theages asks Socrates, well, aren't you a gentleman? Socrates does not answer. Perhaps most importantly, Socrates never denies that he can teach Theages what he wants. If anything, Socrates' repeated mentions of divine things may excite Theages' interest. After all, even though Socrates introduces the daimonion by saying that it speaks only to prohibit him or others from doing something, Socrates never says that the daimonion is speaking to him now, telling him not to spend time with Theages. Third, Socrates does claim to know one subject, and even to know it better than anyone who has ever lived or lives now, the subject of erotics, that is, the things of love. Now, it's very rare for Socrates to claim that he knows anything at all. So what could he mean here? It could mean that he knows the ways of love, such as the ways to excite the interest of young men like Theages or Aristides. It could mean that he knows the most proper objects of love. It could mean that his highest knowledge is knowledge of what he does not have, what he lacks, and what he longs for. So could Plato mean that wisdom is somehow found in knowledge, cold, dispassionate knowledge of the things of love? On this note, I want to end with a comment about the final story that Socrates tells about his daimonion. It's that story about the young man Aristides, who says that as long as he was physically present with Socrates, he got better. But as soon as he was away from Socrates, all his improvements seeped away. Now, the story makes it seem as though Socrates' effect is mysterious. It appeals especially to those of us who feel that we just somehow don't get Socrates. There must be something more than these arguments that he makes, something more than human even, something divine, which we outsiders maybe glimpse, but we haven't really been vouchsafed. Of course, it could be that Socrates completely made up this story. And even if he didn't, it is an account of being with Socrates by someone who failed to stay with Socrates. This story, too, is a test, and Theages will test it by being with Socrates. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Theages.